behind the scenes of UFO Cover-Up Live by Charles Lear. If one was to pick a point when ufology went off the rails, October 14, 1988 is one to consider. That was the date that a television show, UFO Cover-Up Live, aired on 130 syndicated channels throughout the United States. It was a flop, but an examination of the people who were involved in the production provides insight into how it came to be that a few dubious individuals left us with what have been convincingly argued are bogus stories and documents that support the idea that the government has recovered crashed alien spaceships and bodies. A lasting belief is that this came about as the result of an organized government disinformation program targeting the UFO community. A question this writer is examining is whether or not this too is bogus. This is a complicated story that starts with self-proclaimed disinformation agent Richard Doty. Doty's Air Force service records show that he worked his way up from being a gate guard at Wiesbaden Air Base in Germany in 1973 to being a detective with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1979. During his time with AFOSI, he became involved with William Moore, who had just come into prominence with the 1980 book, The Roswell Incident, co-authored with Charles Berlitz. According to both Doty and Moore, Doty made an arrangement with Moore to provide him with information that the government had on UFOs and extraterrestrials in exchange for Moore's cooperation in monitoring private UFO investigators and disseminating information. This arrangement is reported to have been partly responsible for the mental collapse of investigator Paul Benowitz. Greg Bishop, a friend of Moore's, wrote a 2005 book, Project Beta, which presents what he could put together of this story. According to Bishop, Benowitz had his own company, Thunder Scientific, and worked on military contracts. He believed he had seen and filmed UFOs over the Monsanto weapons storage facility, which he could see from his second-story deck. He was skilled in electronics and set up an array of signal detection devices and became convinced he was receiving alien transmissions. He approached officials at Kirtland, which has offices housing a wide variety of intelligence agencies, including the CIA and NSA, and he made a presentation of his findings. Naturally, they became concerned, given that Benowitz had signal detection equipment aimed at a secure facility and was, most likely, recording classified transmissions. According to Doty, he was tasked with diverting Benowitz's attention away from Kirtland, and he convinced Benowitz that there was something to Benowitz's belief that there was an underground alien base in Dulce, New Mexico, and went so far as to plant props in the area that would support this and then fly him over the area, pointing them out. In addition to this, Moore and Doty visited Benowitz at his home to review his findings. Bishop, in his book, described the interactions of Doty and Moore with Benowitz. According to Bishop, Benowitz built his own computers and wrote his own software for them to fit his needs. He was interested in decoding what he believed were alien messages, and he wrote a program he believed could do that. Bishop tells the reader he later wrote that he had established direct contact with the alien using a computer and a form of hexadecimal code with graphics and printout. There is another story, the sole source of which Bishop writes was Moore, that J. Allen Hynek confessed to Moore during a 1982 Mutual UFO Network convention that he had given Benowitz a computer with the same sort of program at the behest of the Air Force. A look into Hynek's life and efforts should shed light on the credibility of Moore's claim and also on the credibility of Moore. Other books have been written covering this story, and one of them, Mirage Men, written by Mark Pilkington and published in 2010, was made into a documentary with the same title and released in 2013. In these works, as in Bishop's, the story is told that Moore and Doty encouraged Benowitz's belief while discussing his findings with him, and he eventually became extremely paranoid. Benowitz believed there was an alien invasion underway and wrote a report he called Project Beta. Bishop published the report as an appendix in his book and states that it was previously only available on the Internet in the form of incomplete or severely edited copies. According to him, Benowitz sent copies to Senators Domenici and Schmidt, President Reagan, APRO, and other researchers. Among the things described in the document are these: alien communications, an alien base in Dulce, plans for an alien takeover using mind control through implants, cattle mutilations by the aliens for the purposes of feeding humanoids, and alien-human gene splicing, and how the alien can be fought using a beam weapon that had been funded and constructed by my company. According to Bishop, Gary Massey, a friend of Benowitz, described this. Benowitz had finally barricaded himself in the house and had piled sandbags all around the windows. Bishop tells the reader that, in 1988, Benowitz's family took him to Anna Caseman Mental Health Facility and checked him in for nervous exhaustion. The two main sources for this story are Moore and Doty. Moore told his version to Bishop, and Doty told his version to both Bishop and Pilkington. Moore and Doty also became involved in the MJ-12 story, which involved a suspected group of government insiders who knew the truth about crashed and recovered UFOs and alien bodies, and who prepared briefings for every U.S. president from Truman to Reagan. A story also came out that Doty was part of another group of insiders who used the names of birds as code names, and that group became known as the Aviary. This group supposedly included some who promoted public disclosure of what it was that the government knew about UFOs. If true, there seems to have been a struggle between efforts at disclosure and efforts to disinform. If one takes this tale at face value, it's complicated and convoluted. One way to approach it is to apply the principle of parsimony, also known as Occam's razor, which is the idea that when there are competing stories regarding a particular question, the simplest one is to be preferred. The simplest explanation for the actions of Doty and Moore and how they led to the fantastic stories promoted by them and others on UFO Cover-Up Live seems to be that Doty was a serial liar who puffed himself up as a covert CIA-trained disinformation agent in the eyes of the UFO community, and that Moore was driven by a combination of belief and avarice. In last week's blog, we introduced two people, Richard Doty, a self-professed Air Force Office of Special Investigations disinformation agent, and William Moore, a UFO researcher and co-author of the 1980 book, The Roswell Incident, who had a profound influence on the UFO narrative in the 1980s that culminated in a television presentation, UFO Cover-Up Live. What was discussed, scripted, on the show was the now familiar narrative of Greys, flying saucers, government recovery of crash debris and alien bodies, and subsequent cover-up. Moore and Doty have since come forward as having been partners in what they claimed was a government disinformation program targeting ufologists. We closed with the hypothesis that Doty was acting on his own, and that Moore played along because he had a need to believe and stood to make some money from the inside information that Doty was feeding him and his fellow researchers. This week we'll look at evidence to support that hypothesis. Because Doty has never confessed to acting on his own when he spread disinformation throughout the UFO community, and the Air Force has never confirmed nor denied that he was acting on orders, the following should be looked at as speculation or a thought experiment. To begin, we need to explore the backgrounds of Doty and Moore. Moore had a history of promoting fantastic stories based on questionable anecdotal evidence, and one in particular based on a tale told by a man who later confessed he made the story up. Before the Roswell incident, Moore and Berlitz co-authored the 1979 book, The Philadelphia Experiment. Moore is listed before Berlitz in the byline. The story is that there was an experiment in Philadelphia waters, the Delaware River, where a U.S. Navy ship was instantly transported from its dock in Philadelphia to a dock in the Norfolk, Newport News, Portsmouth area. The story comes from a letter presented in the book with the date given as days later after a previous letter dated January 13, 1956. The letters are from Carl Allen, also known as Carlos Allende, to Morris K. Jessup, and are the genesis of the story that Moore and Berlitz support with anecdotal and circumstantial evidence. Allen/Allende walked into the headquarters of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization in 1969 and confessed that the letters were a hoax, and this was reported in the July-August 1969 APRO Bulletin. There is mention of this in Chapter 6 of the book, where it is described as a so-called confession. Doty's background can be examined by looking at his U.S. Air Force service records and New Mexico State Police personnel file. His Air Force duty history shows he worked in law enforcement for his entire military career and spent his final year as a food services specialist. This seems like an odd assignment for a CIA-trained disinformation agent with highly classified information about UFOs. His personnel file from his time with the state police shows nothing unusual and includes a reprimand for an accident involving a department vehicle and 2 notices of suspensions without pay 1 and 2 days, respectively, for the accident mentioned in the reprimand and an additional accident. Doty doesn't seem to have received any preferential treatment from the department. One thing to consider about Doty's claim of being a CIA-trained AFOSI disinformation agent is that a person in such a position would be compromising such a program or future similar efforts and would be likely breaking a secrecy oath by revealing their covert activities in a public forum. The reader is now invited to consider the following events from the perspective that Doty was acting on his own and feeding Moore information he invented, and that Moore was less than diligent in his research and possibly culpable in promoting a hoax that put private UFO research into a tailspin. At the 2009 MUFON Symposium, Brad Sparks and Barry Greenwood presented a paper titled The Secret Pratt Tapes and the Origins of MJ-12. The paper begins with the information that Robert Pratt, a reporter, author, and former MUFON journal editor, recorded phone conversations with Moore without telling him. They were working on a book that would reveal information Moore was getting from Doty. Pratt suggested it be fictionalized, and Moore begrudgingly went along with that idea. Their work on the book fizzled out by 1984, and nothing from it was published. They were discussing Moore's recent meetings with Doty. Sparks and Greenwood described Moore being in contact with a mysterious Air Force colonel, codenamed Falcon, and that Doty, codenamed Sparrow, was acting as the middleman. According to Sparks, Moore told him he was passing to Doty every scrap of information he and his fellow Roswell investigator, nuclear physicist Stanton T. Friedman, collected on their Roswell investigations and on UFO research and ufologists. The reader is told that, evidently, Doty, the colonel, and the AFOSI set up a feedback loop where they gave forged documents to Moore that supported the information Moore gave to Doty. What was being developed in this loop was the story that the government had recovered crashed saucers, live and dead aliens, and that there was a secret group known as MJ-12 that prepared briefings for every U.S. president since Harry Truman. The first briefing document was said to have been updated for each president, and one reportedly prepared by MJ-12, according to the cover page, for Jimmy Carter in June 1977 was called the Aquarius document because the subject of the briefing is identified as Project Aquarius. The document is included in the paper and contains this revelation. EBE reported that 2,000 years ago, his ancestors planted a human creature on Earth to assist the inhabitants of Earth in developing a civilization. One thing to notice is that Earth is used as a proper noun in this context and is not capitalized in the document. There are also 2 punctuation errors in the briefing, in the form of a missing apostrophe where aliens is being used in the possessive. Errors like these have been noted throughout the documents related to MJ-12 by various researchers such as Jacques Vallée. There is also an Aquarius teletype dated November 80. Near the bottom of Section 2, just before Section 4, there is no Section 3 for some reason, there is this line. The official U.S. government policy and results of Project Aquarius is, note the grammar error, still classified top secret, with no dissemination outside official intelligence channels and with restricted access to MJ-12. This was a very early mention of MJ-12, and possibly the first seen by researchers, as the teletype made the rounds before the briefing document. Kevin Randall describes the teletype's provenance. According to Randall, Moore said he had seen the original document and that he had been handed a retyped version of the document on March 2, 1981, and told to give it to researcher Paul Benowitz. Benowitz never showed the document to anyone, so his having it didn't serve any purpose. The document made its way into the UFO community through Peter Gersten of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. Moore claimed that he had 3 copies, and that one was in a briefcase that was stolen from his car in San Francisco after he had had a meeting with Gersten. According to Moore, he never received a satisfactory explanation of how he, Gersten, received the document. This was the beginning of the MJ-12 mythos, and just before the Majestic 12 documents hit the scene. These caused a great deal of excitement among UFO researchers. If these could be shown to be real, they would prove that the government had recovered saucers and aliens and was hiding this from the public. The first indication that the documents were forged is that they came in an envelope with a postmark from Albuquerque, home of Kirtland Air Force Base, where Doty was assigned. In last week's blog, we looked at evidence that seems to support the idea that self-proclaimed disinformation agent Richard Doty, who was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, was acting on his own. We also looked at evidence that seems to support the idea that William Moore, an author and UFO researcher, who confessed to being in a partnership with Doty, was driven by the desire to make some money from the information Doty was giving him in exchange for his cooperation. Together, they put many UFO researchers into a state of confusion. We ended with the introduction of the Majestic 12 papers into the UFO community. In January 1985, Jamie Shandera, a friend of Moore's who would later appear in several UFO documentaries, listed as self-documentary filmmaker and self-investigative reporter, and whose only credit on IMDb as a professional movie maker is as video for the movie The Devil's Rain, received an envelope in the mail with an Albuquerque postmark. Inside was a roll of film. On the film were images of what has become known as the Eisenhower briefing document. There was also a letter from Harry Truman to James Forrestal with Truman's signature on it. The total number of pages was 8. The pages of the EBD are all stamped Top Secret, Magic, Eyes Only. The front page has the title, Briefing Document, Operation Majestic 12, prepared for President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the date, 10 November 1952. A warning on the bottom states that eyes-only access is strictly limited to those possessing Majestic 12 clearance level. The second page lists the names of the members of the Majestic 12 group. Included among the 12 names given are Roscoe H. Hillencoter, Dr. Vannevar Bush, and Dr. Donald Menzel, an astrophysicist renowned for being a UFO debunker. Page 3 begins with a description of Kenneth Arnold's June 24, 1947 sighting. Then there is a description of a recovery operation located approximately 75 miles northwest of Roswell Army Air Base, where wreckage and 4 alien bodies were recovered. The documents were released to the press by Moore on May 28, 1986, and there were stories about them in the New York Times and Washington Post. Researchers who were familiar with Moore, such as Brad Sparks, Barry Greenwood, and Robert Hastings, were skeptical and have written extensively about their doubts and investigations into the authenticity of the documents and the validity of Moore's claims. Philip Klass, publisher of Skeptics UFO newsletter, wrote a concise summation in the March 1997 issue that tells the story of the efforts of researchers to get to the truth. Klass takes the position that the documents were faked, as do Greenwood, Sparks, and Hastings, and that Moore was in on it. According to Klass, Moore told Sparks on April 16, 1983, that he and Stanton Friedman had run into a dead end in trying to find out who might have been involved in the recovery of the Roswell debris and subsequent later events. Moore made the suggestion to Sparks that fake government documents could be created that might induce people to come forward. Sparks called Friedman and was shocked to find that Friedman was for the idea. Klass quotes from the 1994 book The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt. According to Friedman, among others, Moore had suggested as early as 1982 that he wanted to create Roswell documents, thinking it might open doors that were closed. Klass suggests that Doty might have inspired Moore's idea. He then provides information on Doty. According to him, Doty was assigned to work in counterintelligence at a West German AFOSI post and was dismissed from AFOSI within 2 years for turning in bogus claims about his activities. He served at Kirtland Air Force Base as the manager of the mess hall for non-commissioned officers for the last 2 years before his retirement. According to Klass, Moore first showed the Majestic 12 documents to researcher Lee Graham. Graham made FOIA requests where he mentioned Majestic 12 and listed the members of the group. Graham's habit of sharing his FOIA letters with his fellow researchers got rumors going about the existence of MJ-12 and that there was documentation showing that there really was a flying saucer recovered at Roswell. The first person to write about MJ-12 was Barry Greenwood. Greenwood talked to Graham and then published the list of MJ-12 members in the December 1985 issue of Just Cause, along with a biography for each of them. Class brings up what he suspects was Moore's plan for exploiting the MJ-12 papers. Moore published snippets of information from the papers in his newsletter, Focus, and told readers it came from high-level sources in intelligence. The problem was that once the papers were finally revealed to his fellow researchers and the media, because Moore was the obvious beneficiary in terms of book sales, speaking fees, and appearances, this would arouse suspicion that Moore had a hand in the creation of the documents if they were discovered to have been hoaxed. Glass wrote that a solution to this problem came when Moore met British UFO researcher Timothy Good in May of 1986. Moore made an arrangement with Good that Good could publish the papers in his book Above Top Secret that was scheduled to be put out in July 1987. Not only would this make it look like both Moore and Good got the documents independently from a source or sources in the intelligence community, the documents would receive immediate international coverage. Moore and Friedman were scheduled to speak on June 14, 1987, at the 24th Annual UFO Conference, sponsored by Moore, in Burbank, California, and it was announced that they would reveal some very startling material. Unfortunately for them, Good's publisher decided to hold a press conference on May 29th of that year and feature the book's MJ-12 documents. Good informed Moore of his publisher's plans, and Moore had to scramble to release his copies first. He got them to the media on May 28th, just one day before the British press conference. Class is infamous among UFO researchers as an arch debunker. However, in this case, his conclusions are supported by the writings of Sparks, Greenwood, and Hastings, with Hastings being the only one of the three convinced that there was an official U.S. Air Force disinformation program involved in promoting the MJ-12 story. In his essay, MJ-12, The Hoax That Quickly Became a Disinformation Operation, Hastings wrote this: While Greenwood and Randall believed that a simple hoax designed to make money was perpetrated by researcher Bill Moore and U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations Special Agent Richard Doty, I contend the available evidence strongly suggests that the MJ-12 fraud, while originating as a hoax, was quickly co-opted by AFOSI and perhaps other intelligence groups as a means to disinform, misdirect ufologists and the public at large regarding the nature and extent of the U.S. government's involvement with the UFO phenomenon. Next week, the Aviary and UFO cover-up. In last week's blog, we looked at the Majestic 12 papers and how UFO researchers came to believe that they had been hoaxed. Air Force Office of Special Investigations Special Agent Richard Doty was thought to have been responsible for faking the documents, and author-researcher William Moore introduced them to his fellow researchers and then presented them to the media. This week, we'll look at how Moore and Doty became involved in the television production UFO Cover-Up Live. Along with the excitement and confusion generated by the MJ-12 documents, there were rumors that there was a modern version of the MJ-12 group leaking information about the government's secret UFO program. This group reportedly used the names of birds as code names and became known as the Aviary. This seems to have come from a UFO working group made up of people who were members of or had connections to the military and intelligence communities and had a genuine interest in the UFO subject. This was first written about by Howard Blum in his 1990 book, Out There. It also seems that some of the people were open to the New Age mystical ideas that had permeated throughout those communities in the 1980s that were the subject of the 2006 book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, by John Ronson. These were people who conducted remote viewing experiments and went to spoon-bending parties, and one of them, Major General Albert Stubblebine, went on camera and described how he had tried, unsuccessfully, to walk through walls. Doty seems to have become involved with this UFO working group and teamed up with one of them, Robert Collins, a career Air Force intelligence officer who claimed his aviary code name was Condor. They wrote a 2006 book together with Timothy Good titled The Black World of UFOs, Exempt from Disclosure. Much has been written about the Aviary and who might have been members. Isaac Coy posted a thread in 2015 titled Remote Viewing in UFOs, Stargate, Galactic Federation, plus the Aviary, CIA Index plus 92,010 pages, on the above top secret forum. Adam Gorightly looks at the subject in his 2021 book, Saucers, Spooks, and Kooks, and includes a list of reported aviary members derived from multiple sources: Richard Doty, Sparrow, Robert Collins, Condor, Ernie Kellerstrauss, Hawk, Dale Graff, Harrier, John Alexander, Penguin, Jamie Shandera, Woodpecker, C.B. Scott Jones, Chickadee, Dr. Christopher Kit Green, Blue Jay, Dr. Hal Putoff, Owl, Dr. Ron Pandolfi, Pelican. Isaac Coy's thread provides links to many of the articles written on this subject. Several of the people in the above list have publicly stated that they were indeed part of this group, and descriptions of it range from it being an informal discussion group of military and intelligence insiders with an interest in the paranormal and UFOs to, in Gorightly's words, insider spooks who are trying to poison the well of UFO research. Gorightly sides with the informal discussion group idea, and we do here as well because it seems to be the simplest explanation. For the purposes of this story, we're particularly interested in Robert Collins. Collins and Doty appeared as Condor and Falcon, respectively, on UFO Cover-Up Live. They appear in silhouette, with their voices electronically altered in pre-recorded videotapes. Gorightly references an article by Vince Johnson, The Aviary, the Aquarium, and Eschatology. In it, there is a list of reported aviary members, similar to Gorightly's, which omits Pandolfi's name, but has his code name Pelican, and a description of Pandolfi's position at CIA as a physicist with the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, who mans the Weird Desk, UFOs, etc., at CIA. Pandolfi is described in section H4 of Coy's thread as the successor of Kit Green as the CIA's Keeper of the Weird, working with the CIA's Weird Desk. Johnson asked Pandolfi, whom he refers to only as Pelican throughout the article, about the aviary. According to Johnson, and in Johnson's words, Pandolfi said that the aviary is nothing more than the product of the somewhat deranged mind of Falcon, retired Air Force Captain Robert Collins. Pandolfi went on to describe how Collins was discharged from the Air Force after being arrested inside the security perimeter of the Manzano nuclear weapons storage facility. According to Pandolfi, Collins told his captors that he was there to meet the president. Pandolfi also said that Collins sent him letters with his, Pandolfi's, real name on the outside, we assume that meant the envelope, and his code name in the letter, and that he, Pandolfi, put the letters up on the walls of his office to amuse his colleagues. Gorightly references a section in the Black World exempt from disclosure, where Collins describes a meeting at the home of Ernie Kellerstrauss that included Moore, Shandera, Doty, and John Alexander. According to Collins, they began talking about the ET, who was an ambassador or liaison to the U.S. Looking at various lists of purported aviary members, one can see that there are a few names that have been associated by their own admission and documentation that can be found in Coy's thread with a remote viewing program called Project Stargate, set up by the DIA at Fort Meade, Maryland, in 1978. Gorightly references interviews that Bruce Maccabee conducted with Ernie Kellerstrauss, Lieutenant Colonel, USAF retired, and published in 1985 in an article titled Hawk Tales. Starting on page 59 of the article, Kellerstrauss, referred to only as Hawk by Maccabee, describes getting information from Dale Graff, a one-time director of Project Stargate, about EBEs, one of whom liked to go to the beach, recovered craft, and a book where all of this was documented. Kellerstrauss talks about Graff's intense interest in the paranormal and out-of-body experiences on page 62. In his epilogue on page 64, Maccabee wrote this: "One big thing should be mentioned to put this into a special historical context. In the middle 1970s, the CIA established a top-secret program to investigate remote viewing. Maccabee describes that some remote viewers reported seeing UFOs and tells the reader that this established a connection, not an expected or wanted connection, between the remote viewing program and UFO investigation. Thus, in 1985, at least in part, as a result of Hawk's testimony, it became apparent that these two parallel investigations were welded together at a highly classified level. What seems to have happened is that information from remote viewers and other dubious sources, particularly Doty, took on a life of its own. This information got passed around military and intelligence circles, fed out to UFO researchers, who fed it back to them in a feedback loop, and a lot of outlandish stories came out of this that some of those involved in the feedback loop came to believe, even though the stories had nothing to back them up. Because they came from government insiders, they took on an air of credibility. With the Majestic 12 papers in the public discourse, that a version of this group might exist in the present day didn't seem that far-fetched. This all set the stage for the wild tales that were going to be presented as fact by credible-seeming sources in front of millions of viewers on UFO Cover-Up Live, because Moore and Shandera were the ones who brought the Majestic 12 documents to the public's attention, and because they seemed to be in touch with a secret group of government insiders. They were scheduled to be the first guests, and Moore served as a technical consultant. Next week, finally, UFO Cover-Up Live. This is the last of what has turned into a 5-part series looking into the events that led up to, and the people who became involved with, the television production UFO Cover-Up Live, which aired on October 14, 1988. It seems that the show's producer, Michael Seligman, believed that it would be the vehicle for an earth-shaking UFO disclosure. What resulted was a clumsy and awkward production where the only disclosure anyone remembers is that aliens like strawberry ice cream. Robert Scivaria wrote a 3-part series of articles titled The Cover-Up Behind UFO Cover-Up Live for Diabolique magazine, the first of which was posted on May 17, 2022. Scivaria spoke to Curtis Brubaker, who came up with the idea for the show, and Tracy Torme, who produced the segment of the show devoted to the Gulf Breeze, Florida sightings and the pictures taken by Ed Walters. According to Scivaria, Brubaker was an industrial designer who worked as a special effects coordinator on the late 1970s TV show Project UFO. He was driving in Los Angeles with his wife, and they were listening to a radio show that had Bill Moore and Jamie Chandere on as guests. Brubaker told Scivaria, "I listened carefully to all the stuff they were saying, and told my wife, if all this shit is going on, these abductions and all this stuff, somebody ought to file a lawsuit and take the government to court. We ought to get some expert witnesses and find out what the hell is really going on, because this is an invasion of Americans' privacy." Instead of taking the government to court, Brubaker came up with the idea for UFO Cover-Up Live and pitched it to LBS Communications, which had just had great success with the mystery of Al Capone's vaults in 1986 and returned to the Titanic live in 1987. Brubaker suggested Tracy Torme to produce the Gulf Breeze segment. Torme, a TV producer and member of the Writers Guild, was quite familiar with the UFO subject and has described his interest as lifelong. According to Scivaria, problems appeared from day one. The two men who had produced the specials on Al Capone's vaults and the Titanic were busy with a follow-up to the Titanic special. A low-level producer, Michael Seligman, was the only one from the former 2 specials available, and he, by all accounts, was not very familiar with the subject of UFOs. The Writers Guild was on strike at the time, but Seligman found a willing scab in the person of Barry Taff. Taff's only production credit was as a consultant for the 1982 supernatural horror film The Entity. He actually investigated the case on which it is based, and his experience as a writer consisted of writing articles on UFOs and the paranormal for magazines. He was let go early on, and Torme told Scivaria that the production staff pressured him to write, but he refused. Taff wrote articles for UFO magazine, and not long after the show aired, editor Vicky Cooper posted a first-hand account written by Taff later denied writing it, on UFO BBS, UFO Bulletin Board System. Taff, we're going with the idea that it was Taff, described that the opportunity to work with UFO consultants such as William Moore, Jamie Chandere, and Stanton Friedman was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. According to Taff, rumors started circulating that the show was being influenced by insiders who were supposedly government intelligence officers from such agencies as CIA, NSA, or even MJ-12. Some of the creative staff found this comical, and someone made up cards ranging from MJ-1 to MJ-12 and taped them to the desks of the production staff. Taft describes the first dark clouds appearing after the producer, Seligman is not mentioned by name throughout, started having meetings with Condor and Falcon. He describes him becoming so paranoid that he became irrational, and that his incredible indecisiveness drove the creative staff to distraction. In the article by Robbie Graham, The Tom DeLonge Delusion, posted November 15, 2016, on Mysterious Universe, Torme is quoted giving his version of what happened. Bill Moore wanted to get involved in the project because he'd heard all about it, so he came in, and it was very, very cloak and dagger. He insisted on meeting the producers behind closed doors, and they couldn't tell any of us what they had discussed. Before long, Moore flew the producers out to an island in the middle of the Great Lakes, where he introduced them to his inside informants, Falcon, Doty, not Rositsky, and Condor, Robert Collins. Torme also described Seligman as becoming irrational. One of the decisions Seligman made, which Torme considered irrational, was insisting that the entire show be scripted and that everyone read off cue cards. This made for some very awkward moments during the airing, as some of the guests were quite inept at this. When the show went live, Mike Farrell of MASH fame was the hapless host, and he made a heroic effort. He didn't lose his cool even when he was working with a live feed with a bad delay to Russia to talk to two Russian researchers Moore was in touch with. Not only were they bad at cue cards, they were bad at English. There are squeaky chair noises and noises from off-camera which add to the amateurish quality of the show. There were also phone numbers the viewers could call for a charge of $1 to report close encounters from level 1 to 4, recommend whether or not Congress should look into UFOs, or to report that they'd had no UFO experiences. One moment that raised some eyebrows was during an interview with former Pentagon spokesman and Chief of Public Information for the Air Force, William Coleman. Coleman describes having seen a silver 70-foot disc in 1955 while flying a B-25 over Alabama. According to the thread, The Mysterious Tale of William T. Coleman, ex-Project Blue Book spokesman and UFO experiencer, on the Above Top Secret forum, Coleman came forward with this story on the Merv Griffin Show in 1978. After all the lead-up stories and discussion, when it was time for the big reveal, viewers were shown two government insiders identified as Falcon and Condor, with their faces in shadow and their voices electronically altered. Farrell acts as if he's actually talking to Falcon, but, according to Sciavaria, he had been recorded in 1983 for a CBS 60-minute segment that never aired. Peter Leone, identified on the show as executive producer of news for the CBS station in Los Angeles, states that he had met and verified the identity of Falcon in 1983 and 1987. There have been disagreements as to who these men were, but Robert Collins stated that he was Condor and that Doty was Falcon in the 2005 book he and Doty co-authored with Timothy Good, The Black World of UFOs Exempt from Disclosure. Although Doty has continually denied he was Falcon, he is listed as Falcon in the cast list for the show on IMBD, and Condor is anonymous. Doty, as Falcon, declares that there is one alien guest in the U.S. at that time as part of an exchange program, and that there had been 3 since 1948-49. The first one was held captive after a crash in New Mexico, and the second was also part of an exchange program. His description is much like that of the iconic gray alien. He says that there are both males and females, and that they have 4 fingers with no thumbs. He says they eat vegetables, enjoy ancient Tibetan music, and that their favorite snack is strawberry ice cream. Because of these and other ridiculous statements made throughout the show, such as Stanton Friedman stating that he and his fellow researchers could prove that there was a crash at Roswell that was covered up and that alien bodies were recovered and taken away for autopsies, there was speculation that the government used the show as a disinformation vehicle. According to Sciavaria, Seligman has denied that there was any interference from the intelligence community. There's a chapter in Jim Moseley's 2002 book, Shockingly Close to the Truth, Confessions of a Grave-Robbing Ufologist, regarding the Air Force's UFO policy, titled Planned Confusion or Pure Stupidity. As we have been trying to stick to the principle of parsimony throughout this series, if one applies that question to UFO cover-up, live, the simplest answer is to be preferred. Thanks to Kirk Collins and Kevin Randall for their comments and insight.